So when we asked them explicitly, why don't you use the forecast or take an avalanche skills course? Two-thirds responded that they think they do not expose themselves to avalanche terrain. This represents a basic lack of awareness of avalanches and avalanche terrain, since we now know that all participants are exposed to some level of avalanche terrain in the least. And otherwise, participants didn't take a course for a few reasons, because they don't have time, we're generally too lazy. I don't think that was your answer, Scott, but some folks were generally too lazy. Courses are too expensive. They're unaware of courses or don't go snowshoeing and winter hiking enough.
Welcome to the BC Search and Rescue Association's AdventureSmart Expert Webinar Series.
Our guest tonight, Griffin, possesses a diverse background in outdoor education, parks, resource management, and environmental planning, which he has developed through both academic study and practical experience. Currently, he's involved with the BC Parks Foundation. We do some work with them as well. They're great, where he plays a role in the planning, management, and protection of natural areas throughout the province. Previously, he managed the snowshoe trails at Mt Seymour Resort. It's one of the spots I used to work as well, Mt Seymour Provincial Park, years ago, where he supported outdoor education initiatives and helped connect people with the winter mountain environment. It's such a great spot to do that. It's really great to connect with people there. In his presentation today, Griffin will share insights from his research conducted in the Avalanche Research Program at Simon Fraser University. He designed and executed a master's project aimed at understanding the experiences of snowshoers and winter hikers, that's all of you here tonight, in avalanche-prone areas, exploring ways to enhance awareness of avalanche information resources, improve backcountry preparedness, and promote safety in these environments. Griffin fits right into the wheelhouse of what we like to do and who we want to talk to. And we're really excited to have you here tonight, Griffin. Welcome to the stage, and we can't wait to hear your presentation tonight.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Sandra. I'm going to share my screen here, and then we can so first and foremost, I want to acknowledge the Coast Salish people, including the Coquitlam, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, whose territories our work occurs on. And although this research doesn't engage explicitly with Indigenous people and Indigenous worldviews, I do encourage everybody here, whether you're new to the region or you've been here for a long time, to reflect on how this research might. And that's really in order to better serve the needs of those who live and recreate in these regions. So thanks so much for everyone for coming. I'm really excited to be here today to share the insights I've learned from spending this past winter up in Mt Seymour Provincial Park. A huge thank you to BC AdventureSmart for hosting this webinar series. I think it'll prove to be super useful in spreading the message on backcountry safety, especially in the winter and in avalanche terrain, which I'll be talking about today. So the title of the presentation, Understanding Exposure to Avalanche Terrain and Avalanche Information Product Use of Snowshoers and Winter Hikers, sharing the insights from Mt Seymour Provincial Park. So over the past 2 years, I've gotten to do a master's in the Avalanche Research Program up at Simon Fraser University. That's here in the Lower Mainland. And the research group led by Pascal Hegley is an interdisciplinary research program that's really at the interface between the natural and social sciences. It involves close collaboration with industry partners focusing on avalanche hazard assessment, avalanche risk communication, quantifying avalanche risk, and risk management through terrain selection. A bit more about me personally, though, for context on this project. I currently, sort of as Sandra said, work on land management planning for the BC Parks Foundation. For the past 5 winters, I've worked at Mt Seymour Resort in the Snowshoe Center on the North Shore here in the Lower Mainland. I supervised a team of over 20 outdoor educators preparing for snowshoe tours in the resort's maintained Discovery Snowshoe Trail network. It's about 10 kilometers of trails. The Snowshoe Center also has a fleet of snowshoe rentals that I saw regularly sell out on busy weekends, and we rented upwards of 400 snowshoes at a given hour on a busy Saturday during a snowy winter. So all this is to say that I've seen the high demand for snowshoeing and the accessibility it provides for just about anyone to get out into the mountains into the winter or in the winter. And what's more is that this community seems to be growing, as we can see by the participation in this webinar, and that they're actually becoming part of our statistics. Just this past March, a couple set off a size 2 avalanche in Mt Seymour Provincial Park, with one being fully buried except for the tip of a snowshoe that allowed the other to successfully recover them. And thankfully, both survived. There's examples from Mount Harvey and Mount Hector in Banff. Mount Harvey's on the sea to sky, Mount Hector's in Banff, both in 2017, and they underline a need to better understand this community. So the main objective of this study was to find out what we don't know about this community, because we don't know where snowshoers and winter hikers are traveling, nor do we understand how exposed they are to avalanche terrain. We don't know what training they possess to understand what skills they have if and when traveling in avalanche terrain. And we don't know what information they use to plan their trips so that more targeted avalanche safety messages can reach this community. And if you haven't guessed it by now, when I say they, I mean you all, I mean myself, even at times, I mean friends, I mean family, I mean those of us who are snowshoeing and winter hiking. So in order to better understand this community and find out what we don't know, we set out to create a survey of targeted at snowshoers and winter hikers. Informed by roundtable discussions with community partners like the mountain resort operators up at Mt Seymour, provincial park agencies, conservation organizations, avalanche and backcountry safety organizations, search and rescue groups, and avalanche safety course providers, we designed a survey about avalanche awareness among snowshoers and winter hikers that builds on the existing community knowledge to identify concerns and ensure that we ask relevant research questions. So in an effort to find out what we don't know, we asked ourselves, what are the general levels of avalanche terrain that snowshoers and winter hikers expose themselves to? What are snowshoers and winter hikers' use of formal avalanche safety products and services? And how do their practices relate to their exposure to avalanche terrain? And what are the common reasons for the use or non-use of formal avalanche safety products and services? To answer these questions, we created 2 surveys. The first was conducted in person on Mt Seymour Main Trail in Mt Seymour Provincial Park. I would stand up there at the trailhead and stop pretty much everybody passing by, either just leaving for a trip or just returning, and ask if they wanted to complete a survey.
Even
I'd
stopped
ask them
me.
questions in a, yeah, Scott, we talked.
Yeah, we
And
talked
I'd
at one
ask them
point in time, and
questions
I
in a
had no clue
semi,
this was coming.
exactly. So I would ask people like Scott questions in a semi-interview style and input their answers myself into a tablet. And from mid-December to the end of March, I was up there with a few outdoor educators from Mount Seymour and a research assistant from SFU standing under the Park Ambassador tent. We were just having this conversation beforehand, but the Park and Ambassador program, for those who don't know, is set up by BC Parks and the BC Parks Foundation in parks across the province to provide outdoor education to park users. And up in Mount Seymour, they've had a sign updated with updated avalanche conditions as well as a display of avalanche safety gear. I'm not sure if they'll still be up there this year, but they were up there last year for sure, and that's kind of where I hung out. And for those of you who don't know as well, Mount Seymour Provincial Park, near and dear to many of us, is on the North Shore, about 30 minutes from Vancouver on a good day when there's no snow on the roads and we can all get there safely in our vehicles with snow tires. It holds one of 3 ski resorts on the North Shore. On the left there, you can see is Cypress, in the middle is Gross, and that's Seymour there on the right. Throughout winter, the park is popular for backcountry skiing, splitboarding, out-of-bounds resort skiing, snowshoeing, and winter hiking. The main trailhead was also a great place to conduct the surveys because it's really at the nexus of trails leading to a variety of terrain types. So there's a lot of different people passing by, going to a lot of different places. The second survey we created was an avalanche course survey, and that was administered by Canada West Mountain School, who provides a snowshoe-specific avalanche skills course. The purpose of this survey was to have a sample of snowshoers and winter hikers that we can compare to our main survey, and we kind of analyzed them independently but then made comparisons where appropriate between those who have and have not taken a specific avalanche skills course. So getting kind of right into the results here, now that I've told you what the whole research was kind of about, I kept this slide a bit more brief just to give a quick snapshot of what the folks kind of look like that I was talking to up there, the participants, generally in both samples of snowshoers and winter hikers. So there was a wide range of experience levels, but the majority were relatively new to snowshoeing and winter hiking, with just over half with 5 years or less experience going out 5 days or less per winter. Does it sound like anybody? Sounded like me when I started out snowshoeing. It was just like,
Wow,
okay,
I'm
I'll
actually
take
sort
it
of
slow.
surprised. So 5 days or less, it was the majority of people?
Just over half go out 5 days or less
Wow.
per winter.
That's
Yeah.
Sandra does. I don't know. Maybe it's just me. That sort of shocks me a bit because I would have assumed that the people going up to Seymour specifically would be people who were locals and who would go out on a regular basis.
Yeah, and it was running through my mind too when you're speaking here, Griffin. I was thinking back to my early days working in the park and what it was like then versus now. And I was going to ask you, but you've answered my question before I even asked. What was it like for you now in this time frame and collecting this information versus what I remember seeing hands on, face to face in the field. And I'm surprised too at that, actually, Scott. I agree with you. I would have thought it would have been more consistently from the lower mainland. That's a broad stroke, right? Valley up the sea to sky. That might be using this area that frequent it more than that. I've noticed in my time in the field out there playing, hiking, biking, skiing, whatever we all do out there, especially in the snow, that the users have changed. The users have changed. There's no question. In the early years of my career, dating myself here, but that's okay. It was more of an outdoor club of a user, right? They belonged possibly to a club and they were mentored by club members and they were experienced or getting that experience from others versus being brand new and meeting up or just meeting at the
Mm.
trailhead. Scott, you and I have had this conversation a bunch, right? So the user groups have changed, but it's still very interesting to hear Griffin say this and surprisingly in a roundabout way because we know the traffic this part gets, we know the visibility it has, and we know the accessibility it has,
And
which
now
makes
you
it
have to get a
super
day pass,
enticing. And
right?
now for certain times, yeah, for certain times of the year, you
Interesting
need the
because
day pass.
that changes
Yeah.
the thing because someone actually in the past you used to be able to just go up on a whim, and now if it's you have to go up on less of a whim because you have to request a day pass.
In certain windows of their time. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Sorry,
Really
Griffin.
interesting, Griffin. Thank you.
I'll touch on a couple of those actually just almost immediately here. But the second point there, most participants, or the third point there, most participants have microspikes, but just over half have snowshoes as well. So we'd often see folks with snowshoes on their pack having taken them off for microspikes because they're mostly hard pack trails up there. So there's a bit of a blurry line between what actually characterizes a snowshoer versus a micro spiker or just a winter hiker in boots. And that's kind of why we tried to capture all of those. But for the most part, participants were traveling um, in groups of two or more, although a substantial amount, it was about 11%, still travel alone, um, which is significant enough to consider. But groups were mostly not any organized community groups like BCMC or Vancouver Hikers or some university group. They were just kind of friends or families going out. So they weren't part of clubs, so to speak. But um, following up to that, mostly speaking English, and it was seconded by Cantonese and Mandarin. But they also do not participate in any other winter backcountry activities that might be exposed to avalanche hazard, avalanche terrain. Um, so kind of just going
That
out there
one
to
sort
hike
of
or snowshoe.
shocks me a bit too. Uh,
Mhm.
okay, so these people, the majority of people don't go skiing or anything else. I guess if they only do 5 days a year, I guess that's not too surprising. But that I would have expected to hear that you'd still have a lot of people who would do skiing and other forms of winter backcountry.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
So you can see there's starting to be a characterization of who's actually going out, and it's kind of the not entirely just kind of the entry level folks, but just people who are relatively new or just want to go out there to kind of go for a walk, go for a hike, and maybe get exercise or something like that.
So it's a
Um,
combination of novice and novelty, right? Because they're only going out there for 5 days in the winter. It's a novelty thing. It's something
Right.
and if they don't participate in any other backcountry activities, then they're novices. So it's sort of that combination, which is an interesting view. And I suspect probably not a view that would necessarily be shared on, say, someone going into Sun Peaks or other parts of the province, because it's not as easily accessible as Mount Seymour is.
Yeah, I also want to
so
tap into Rosanna's comment, and I was just about to say that, but you beat me to the punch, Rosanna. Good for you. It's accessible. It's not as expensive as other winter activities, and it's free of charge once you get a little bit of gear, right? So you're not paying for a ticket. It's a lot cheaper than skis and boots and poles and goggles. And yes, we have all the other gear that we tell you to carry, the essentials and whatnot, but more than not, it's accessible financially as well.
Yeah, exactly. So this kind of gives a snapshot of the majority. It's not to say that there aren't the keeners who are still going out and really trying to peak bag and that sort of thing, but this is just a snapshot of the majority of folks who are going out that I really wanted to highlight here. Um, and so moving into the first big question that we wanted to answer, we want to know where exactly snowshoers and winter hikers are going in relation to avalanche terrain. So we asked them to state 3 typical winter trip destinations that they would typically snowshoe or winter hike. Examples from Mount Seymour are Dog Mountain, First Peak, or Pump Peak, if you want to make a pun about it, and Mount Seymour Peak or Third Peak. The names are, I don't know if they're more colloquial or they've been changed over the years, but they have a few different ways to refer to them. But all 3 trips that I kind of just mentioned provide views of Vancouver and the coast in a variety of terrain. So to determine how exposed participants were on their stated trip destinations, we then paired their stated locations with ATES ratings. So for those who don't know, ATES, ATES, or Avalanche Terrain Exposure Scale, is a rating system for determining the exposure to avalanche terrain based on things like slope angle, avalanche path, and start zones or other factors along those lines. And on the right, you can see an example of an ATES map for Mount Seymour, and where the green indicates simple terrain, the blue indicates challenging terrain, and the black is for complex terrain. And here, this is the original ATES version 1 of those maps that are widely available. There's also an ATES version 2 that does now classify non-avalanche terrain and extreme terrain. The reason for that kind of classification change is that, and they're pretty rigorous with, and almost reluctant, you could say, about classifying things as non-avalanche terrain, is because they have to be really sure that it's not avalanche terrain to classify it as such, to give the public that confidence that they're going into an area that is guaranteed to not have any risk of avalanches. So you can see this map of Seymour. It's it's every type of avalanche terrain from the original 3. But we did cross-reference those with V2, and we didn't find any stated destinations that we could confidently call non-avalanche terrain or extreme terrain. And as you can see here as well, the yellow trail there for popular routes passes through all 3 types of avalanche terrain. And on the left is a view of First or Pump Peak, including both challenging and complex terrain.
And correct me if I'm wrong, the winter trail actually sort of disappears there, right? So the winter trail doesn't go all the way up to the top. The winter trail ends partway through there.
Yeah. So it is marked by BC Parks, I believe, up to Pump Peak, up to First Peak with the poles. But beyond that, it's not marked. You can kind of see how that line goes up to Pump Peak. So using the maximum rating from each participant's stated destination as kind of a proxy for exposure to avalanche terrain, we found that all participants, every single one, was exposed to some level of avalanche terrain, where 58% were traveling in avalanche terrain, seconded by 29% in simple terrain and 13% in complex terrain. However, most of them were staying on marked trails. And from our conversations with folks at the trailhead, there appeared to be a perception that marked trails were actually safe, which isn't always the case. So we wanted to find out, is there even a concern for avalanches by participants traveling in these areas? And so this figure shows the level of concern for avalanches broken down by the type of avalanche terrain. I'll kind of walk through this a little bit so we can all kind of get on the same page and see what we're looking at here. The 3 rows on the left column indicate the type and total number of participants in that category. So the type of terrain and the total number of participants in that category. The percentage in each section of the bars shows the distribution of each answer in that category. So how many people answered that specific question that way. And we asked, how concerned are you about the risk of avalanches on your typical trips? And we found that generally there's a lack of concern for avalanches by participants in the survey at about 45%, although that concern seems to grow as participants enter more dangerous terrain. But on the other hand, 55% considered avalanches at least a minor concern. And if we look just at the green bars here, those who considered it at least a key concern became concerned mostly because of friends, social media, or the internet, which isn't really surprising there, but only 20% because they took an avalanche course. Digging a
Wow.
little deeper as well, though, we wanted to find a bit more about where participants were getting their information, not only about avalanches specifically, but trip planning generally. Because I'm up there doing a survey about avalanches. If they kind of get wind that I'm doing about avalanches, people might have a bias to say, "Oh, I'm concerned about avalanches," or I have a bit more of a concern. But so we wanted to dig a little deeper here. And when we asked snowshoers and winter hikers what sources of information they used for planning their winter hikes and their snowshoeing trips, we found that the most popular information sources are online trip descriptions like All Trails and other trip blogs, followed by the weather forecast and the local mountain website. Interestingly, only about a quarter of folks said they seek out the avalanche forecast. If you don't know that, it gives a daily rating for current avalanche conditions. And for planning their snowshoeing, or that's for planning their snowshoeing and winter hiking trips. So participants were generally not aware of a few other avalanche safety information products as well. You can kind of let me know in the comments if you're aware of these as well. So there's AIDS Maps, Avi Savvy, the Mountain Information Network reports, the Evaluator Decision Tool, North Shore Snowpack summer YouTube videos from AJ with North Shore Rescue. And about 70 to 80% of participants don't know these products. So that's okay if you don't know them either. Just let this be a quick PSA that these exist, and they're super useful to kind of dive through. They're not necessarily just you look at them, you understand them. You got to take a bit of time to get to know them, but they're very worthwhile products and services.
Uh,
And so
yeah,
only about
Really?
39% as well of participants actually use special public avalanche warnings.
Wow.
Yeah.
one of the things, so on the previous slide where you had the,
You have a question there?
yeah, can you hear me?
Sorry, it was stalling out there.
My apologies. On your previous slide, you had mentioned that there was a majority of people who thought it was a minor concern. Was it a concern on the day that you're asking? So in other words, did you find that on days where the avalanche risk was higher, that people were more concerned? Or did you like, was there any correlation?
We wanted to explicitly separate that so that the way we framed the conversation kind of at the beginning was how you think about your typical trips that you go on, not necessarily the day, because it would have
Gotcha.
been too difficult and just we didn't really have the capacity to kind of go back retroactively or keep track of that and make that comparison, whether people knew of the forecast or not, whether they were making that calculation. We kind of wanted to just leave that out for now and do a more general overview. Sandra, you have a question?
I do. In my work, I'm always thinking about behavioral change. You know, at BC AdventureSmart, we're trying to instill best practices, right? People's thoughts, decisions, pre-trip, during trip, in an trip, in an emergency, and post. I sit on an international forum with others from around the world, and we talk about this specifically, behavioral change. And I find it really interesting. If we go forward to your slide you were on, we'll leave Scott's here and go to the next one. I'm I think about the longevity that the likes of Avalanche Canada has, that BC AdventureSmart has. We're both 2 decades into our work, and I've seen some change over those 2 decades. We've seen some behavioral changes, some best practices applied. And so I find it still very interesting. And maybe it goes back to my other point of the user group is different. For me to see these stats from my perspective as a professional in this industry, that these percentages, 77%, 83, 72, don't know about the min, you know what I mean? Like this is it's really something. I'm slightly baffled a little bit and still feel I've got a lot of work to do, I guess is what it's pointing me in the right direction of that. But also, I know behavioral change takes a long time. If we go back to early days when we all were just learning to put seatbelts on as a habit, that took time. Did it take a generation? I don't know the answer to that, but I'm just making some observations really from someone who's been in the industry doing what I do for work, and to still see these percentages. It speaks to the user group, I think, is maybe what I'm going to get out of that.
Yeah,
So
and Jean
sharing some
Stéphane makes a
thoughts.
very good point there. It's also goes back to where I was saying it's a combination of novices and novelty. So this is like something they don't do that often. It's something, oh, hey, it looks nice. It's a great day. Let's go out and play in the snow,
Yeah,
right? So you've
yeah.
got that combination of it's something not only are they new to it, it's something that they only intend on doing rarely, just because they want to literally play in snow because they live in Delta or Richmond or whatever.
It goes back to that access, right? And
Yeah.
that novelty and the unawareness, right? Yeah, good conversations over here in the chat too. Thank you.
So from there, when we look at the avalanche forecast specifically here, just kind of pinning down, we can see a similar figure that's depicted as the one depicted earlier, but with the level of awareness for Avalanche Canada and the avalanche forecast, and that's broken down by terrain type as well. So as we can see on the left in the reds and yellow, about 64% of participants are either completely unaware of the forecast in Avalanche Canada or do not use it to inform their trips. And for the 36% who do use the forecast, we can also break them down based on their user type. So 39% self-identified as type B, avalanche forecast user, which means they base their decision whether to go into the backcountry or not purely on the danger rating in the forecast. So whether it's low, moderate, considerable, high, or extreme. So a pretty rudimentary use regardless. And when we ask them about their thresholds, so when at what danger rating do they not go snowshoeing or winter hiking, about a quarter said they still travel under considerable or higher danger rating levels, meaning their use of the forecast does not always even affect their decision to travel into the backcountry. However, with that in mind, we were able to get multiple suggestions for improving the forecast that might make it more usable for snowshoers and winter hikers. So about 1/3 of participants who used the forecast offered suggestions for how to improve it. That's about 50 participants. 7 suggested improving the phone app to make it more user-friendly for trip planning. 8 suggested adding links to the forecast for other information sources like weather and all trails, so that when you look at the forecast, you can kind of quickly access other relevant information. There were suggestions related to maps, like adding in more trail-specific information and either embedding an 8th layer into the forecast or providing a more obvious link, like in the previous suggestion. And other suggestions relating to the forecast included simplifying terminology to make it just easier to understand. And then the final 7 suggested increasing awareness of the forecast through social media, school visits, in-person outreach, and things that we're doing right now, like a webinar. So I encourage you also to throw that in the chat if you have any suggestions for improving the forecast. If you're a forecast user, throw those in the chat and we can talk about those.
Yeah, putting the
Whether
eights
now
is an
or
interesting one. So if you had
Mhm.
an eights plus the thing, you essentially have your evaluator, right? So you've
Very
the combination of the forecast and the eights means that
Mhm.
this particular area is extremely high risk, as opposed to just the high threshold, right? So that would be an interesting question. JS was asking along the same lines. Has this information been given to our friends at Avalanche Canada?
Yeah, it kind of would tell you what terrain is safe to travel, but it would make it kind of specific to the conditions of the day, which could be kind of incredibly useful.
Mhm.
So moving on, when we look at the formal levels of avalanche skills training among participants, only about 1/5, so 21% of the sample has introductory or higher level avalanche safety training. And although the proportion of participants with formal training increases as they travel in more serious terrain, it's still relatively small as a total proportion. But we also wanted to know why participants decided to take a course in the first place. And it was because they wanted to increase their safety on backcountry trips and to travel in more serious avalanche terrain. So this tells us that at some point, folks became aware that they were traveling into avalanche terrain and decided to take a course because of that. So I'm going to jump briefly into the avalanche course survey, just with some points to corroborate that finding, where not only do participants from the survey have similar levels of exposure to avalanche terrain, they use the forecast and other information sources a little bit more often and took the snowshoe-specific avalanche skills course for the same reason as participants in the main survey, and that's to increase their safety on backcountry trips and travel in more serious avalanche terrain. So the key question in this research, however, was also to understand why participants do not take an avalanche skills course nor use the forecast. So when we asked them explicitly, why don't you use the forecast or take an avalanche skills course? 2/3 responded that they think they do not expose themselves to avalanche terrain. This represents a basic lack of awareness of avalanches and avalanche terrain, since we now know that all participants are exposed to some level of avalanche terrain in the least. And otherwise, participants didn't take a course for a few reasons, because they don't have time, were generally too lazy. I don't think that was your answer, Scott, but some folks were generally too lazy. Courses are too expensive. They're unaware of courses, or don't go snowshoeing and winter hiking enough. Sorry to pick on you, Scott.
Hey, no problem.
Um,
And to be honest, I am one of the people who think that the courses are too expensive. Like when you look at your outlay for a shovel, a transceiver, a probe, and a course for every person who's there, which is the right thing to do if you're going into significant avalanche terrain in during winter time, that can actually be expensive. It's unfortunate, but it's true.
for something that is, yeah, yeah, for something that can be as easy as just walking out onto the mountain. Now you need this huge investment. So I want to jump quickly into the limitations of this study, because they'll kind of set up a little bit for later. And there's some that are worth mentioning. Because this was a convenience sample, um, the folks who participated were conveniently walking by. Approaching potential participants during the weekdays might have captured a slightly different demographic of snowshoers and winter hikers. But we still believe that focusing on weekends and holidays produced the biggest and kind of most diverse study sample. And during the surveys, we noticed that many avoided or declined participation in our study because they might not have been comfortable with their language skills. So unfortunately, this means that there are a substantial number of snowshoers and winter hikers who were not interviewed, but could have provided important responses and insight for the study. But I think it's also reasonable to assume that avalanche safety challenges that we've identified so far are even larger in this group, since language barriers make it accessing relevant safety information all the more difficult. Um, so this means two things really, this whole presentation, that kind of, firstly is that participants largely cannot identify avalanche terrain. And secondly, that the unawareness of existing exposure to avalanche terrain seems to be a key barrier for the adoption of avalanche safety practices. This generally means that when people don't know they're exposed to avalanche terrain, they won't make the decision to take a course, use safety equipment, read the forecast, everything that we kind of recommend to do. So now that we've identified kind of the issue, I'll first offer here's what practitioners and avalanche safety professionals can do about it. First is make people aware that they're traveling into avalanche terrain with messages that focus on avalanche terrain ID. Um, place messages in commonly used information sources like online trip descriptions and websites like All Trails that people are clearly using. Create short and inexpensive courses focusing on avalanche terrain recognition, and create decision support tools that indicate what trails are appropriate under the existing conditions. And that's that whole combining eights with the forecast idea. And so what can we do as recreationists about it? There's the general winter safety tips like AdventureSmart principles, carrying the 10 essentials, leaving a trip plan, etc. But more specifically, what we've learned from our interviews is kind of the following suggestions for snowshoers and winter hikers alike. First one is know when we're traveling in avalanche terrain. So ask ourselves the question, is this place I want to go in avalanche terrain? And ask it every time, and then find the answer before you go. So if you look at a webinar done 2 weeks ago by Brad Christie, there's some excellent tips for identifying avalanche terrain that I would absolutely recommend to go watch. But that's an important question I ask myself every time I go out. Is this place I'm going to or that I want to go to in avalanche terrain? And then I find the answer. And that helps me kind of follow along the decision tree of how to behave, whether I'm not in avalanche terrain or am in avalanche terrain. So the second one is checking avalanche safety information sources before going out, like the avalanche forecast, the weather forecast, Mountain Information Network reports, and AITS maps. And I know it can be arduous to check so much information before going out, but our safety really is our own responsibility. And the more we know about the area we're traveling in, the safer we'll be. And the third is taking short and inexpensive courses focusing on avalanche terrain recognition. You're doing that right now, taking a webinar for BC AdventureSmart. And you can also watch the webinars from Avalanche Canada. They have a series going on right now that's also wonderful, that has a ton of awesome information. I think last week they did a big one, and someone from BC Parks spoke about Mount Seymour, the Mount Seymour area as well. And then lastly, use decision support tools. That'll help you navigate avalanche terrain. And the evaluator is kind of a key one that helps you really make that assessment when you're in the field, if you are actually in avalanche terrain or going into avalanche terrain. And then another question to ask yourself is really, what type of snowshoer am I? Like, what motivates me? So is it relaxation? Is it enjoying time with friends and family? Or is it exploring new areas, challenging myself, or getting exercise? There's a ton of different motivations, and these are kind of just brief ones that I can list off. But it's important to ask yourself those questions: is why am I actually going out? What do I want to get from this experience in the mountains? And that each decision, whatever motivates you, can come with different levels of risk. So if it's the first two, relaxation, enjoying time with family and friends, you kind of want to figure out how you can make sure you don't enter avalanche terrain. There's plenty of places to go to avoid avalanche terrain that actually don't travel through avalanche terrain, that'll get you a nice view where you can relax, you can enjoy the forest, you can feel connected to nature, you can feel connected to your family and friends. But if it includes any of the latter three, you'll likely be entering avalanche terrain, and that requires a bit more preparation and a bit more training if you're really gonna kind of step yourself up to the level of safety that we recommend when going into these areas. So for the relaxed and social crowd, the key here is to recognize avalanche terrain so that you can avoid it. As I said kind of earlier, a trail doesn't necessarily mean it avoids avalanche terrain if it's marked. Sometimes it's impossible to really avoid all the avalanche terrain features. So, I mean, my recommendation personally would be stay in resort for your first few trips. Kind of get used to what the mountain environment looks like. And if you're looking at expanding your terrain or your motivations might change slightly, just limit yourself to simple terrain. Only go when the danger's low or maybe moderate. It's probably fine to go in moderate, but still be aware that you might be entering an avalanche terrain. Because there may be a few spots where avalanches happen that you have to be able to recognize clearly to avoid. and everywhere else. For exploring and challenging, this includes everything from the previous slide, kind of plus the following. Take a snowshoe specific course. But as we talked about before, there are these barriers. Taking a course is kind of the best way to really get yourself prepped for knowing how to travel in avalanche terrain. And then if you can get a transceiver, shovel, and probe, practice using them. The key is really to know how to use the gear that you have. And then checking the forecast, that's the avalanche forecast or the weather forecast, and checking it regularly so you know how conditions are changing. It's really easy to nerd out about how snow conditions are changing, so I would encourage all of you to do that because it can get super fun and you can get super into snow crystals and different snowpack layers, and it's actually just really fun to get into. But it allows you to know if this weekend has terrible conditions, just you don't have to worry about it. Conditions will change. Next weekend might be fine. The weekend after might be fine. Um, but if you don't know that, then you can't really make that decision to really make that behavior change and act safely in that regard. And then lastly, again, is using those decision support tools like the evaluator, as well as the people in your group to discuss appropriate courses of action. There's a huge level of group dynamics that goes on when we're traveling with friends in avalanche terrain, and it requires quite a lot of communication and just knowing each other's skill levels, knowing what motivates our group members as well, so that we're all on the same page with what we want to do, so that we don't unnecessarily push people to go to places where we're uncomfortable or to make poor decisions, to work ourselves too hard, which makes us make poor decisions as well. So that using kind of everything to your advantage, everybody's skills in your group to your advantages is the best course of action I can really recommend. And I think that really wraps up the presentation with those recommendations. So I just want to thank all the organizations that were involved in this project. Avalanche Canada and MyTax funded the project. So a big thank you to them. My field team for helping me conduct the surveys almost every weekend this winter. My lab group, the research group, and Pascal especially. All the participants in the survey who spoke with me and reminded me of why I do this work. Scott, thank you so much. Anybody else, if you're in the crowd here, thank you so much. And then BC AdventureSmart, of course, for putting on the webinar series. And then just a big thanks to everybody who came for listening. And I hope everyone has a really safe and fun winter.
We
So
have
I'll
a
leave this
ton of
up
questions
just
too.
shortly here so you can get those emails to.
Thank you, Griffin. If I could jump in
Yeah.
quickly before we get to those questions, Scott. Griffin, you've done an amazing job at really
Sure.
outlining what you did, how you did it, where you did it, and who you did it with. And then you summed it up really simply for us. And all of that through there, a lot of it was really speaking to a lot of what we repeatedly, that's not right, what we consistently say about that trip planning phase, about preparing for, understanding what you're getting into, doing that research. And so you hit the nail on the head there a lot, which is really great reinforcement. And that's just, I just wanted to thank you for that, because it's one thing to hear it from us over and over and over, but it's great to hear from other experts in the field like yourself, and all the great suggestions I see in the chat too. You know, Taryn made a great suggestion in working with ambassadors to work on some social campaigns and influencers, and we've dabbled in that before, and I'm happy to do that again. And there's ways to creatively get this out there and have those conversations. It's really about having these conversations with the likes of you, Scott, myself, everyone who's joined us tonight. Search and rescue. It really just takes a conversation amongst us to build upon this safety culture in the province of BC. So I just wanted to make those few points that you reiterated a lot of what we talk about as well, but specifically to your case, which was really interesting for me. I found those stats really, really enlightening. As Scott gets through into the questions, as he's about to jump in, and I can see there's lots of them, which is awesome. Can everyone, before I forget, can everyone just toss where you're sitting in the province? I'm really curious where you're joining us from tonight. Just let us know, put that in the webinar chat. And Scott, the floor is yours to ask these questions.
The first question I had was, like, this information's getting back to Avalanche Canada and such, right? One of your recommendations was to put like a banner or avalanche warning in the descriptions for all trails and such. Do you actually have, or does Avalanche Canada have someone sort of going to do that? Like, is that something they've identified? Okay, yes, we're actually going to do that, and therefore we're going to have someone go through and look at all the trails that are in BC and Alberta and say, okay, this one's avalanche, and then put markers in there. Or is that something that they're gonna try and reach out to the land managers, or is there some kind of plan on that? Because it sounds like a great idea.
Hmm.
It's a
Yeah,
lot of
that was
work though.
actually one of the things that came up as kind of the best bang for the buck solutions there. And I believe that Avalanche Canada is trying to follow through with that. I believe they are trying to reach out to all trails. In conversations, they were very receptive to that, and um, it's yeah, it's part of that just cross collaboration, like putting the information where people are actually accessing it. Um, so I think the simple answer is yes, Avalanche Canada is kind of very interested in following through with getting getting that information where it needs to be.
Marvelous. Can I ask one technical thing before we go much further? If you want to close out other applications on your computer is chopping you up a little bit, and that will probably help out the rest of our conversation.
Yeah.
So we'll hop right into the questions. Uh, there's a lot of them. I'm going to do one for you, Sandra, while we're getting that all straightened out. Fat map, October 1st, 2024, went away. It
Yes.
has been discontinued. It is sad. I have had three questions asking various kinds of what are people using instead of FatMap? Do you have an idea as to what would be good options instead of FatMap?
This ties in a little bit to some work I just did with media lately about a couple calls on the North Shore that were very similar, and it was about hikers using apps.
Hmm.
And those calls, those hikers needed help, is what it ended up being, because they didn't research their information enough. And what I responded to in that is there's a list of apps available that we vetted, and you can find them on the BC Search and Rescue Association's website under the outdoor education banner. The top one is the Adventure Hub. That's the one-stop shop to go to for any outdoor recreation in BC. And we have 17 apps listed in that Adventure Hub that we vetted and included them because we know they're valuable. The AdventureSmart Trip Plan app, for obvious reasons, to file that trip plan with an emergency contact. We've got All Trails in there. We've got Strava. We've got Avalanche Canada's, Parks Canada's. There's a list of them in there that really give you a chance to pick and choose what works for you, depending on the season and the activity. Don't forget about the weather app, Drive BC. There's a lot that needs to go into you getting to your adventure and getting home.
Yep.
So don't just think about the trail to Tim Jones Peak. Think about how you're going to get there, what you're going to do. Think about your emergency contact. So I really suggest people head over to the BC SARA website, bcsara.com. Under the outdoor education banner, you'll see the Adventure Hub, 17 apps right there ready for the taking.
It's in the chat. And one of the things I'd point out when it comes to your apps, bear in mind that a lot of them, like All Trails, which we've said, are sourced by other people. And
Correct.
they, what happens is you'll go into All Trails and you'll start a recording and then you'll go on your hike. If they went on the wrong hike, if they didn't go where they thought they went, and that recording went in there and it got marked as a trail, you will be going to the wrong place too. So you have to, it's a really great idea to take that information and then compare it against, in the case of BC Parks, compare it against a map that BC Parks themselves create. In the case of other land managers, you'd be good like Rex and Parks BC. There's a whole bunch of different great trails. But if you see something that I can't find written anywhere else, it's not in anyone's maps anywhere else, it might not actually be a trail. Uh, so Griffin,
Mhm.
you said you did these surveys on the weekends. Did you go into the night or was it just during the day?
Yeah, it was from about 9 till 3.
Okay.
Yeah, that we found that is we did a preliminary survey kind of 2 years ago to see what would to kind of fine tune the survey and the whole process, and we found those were the most responsive hours. So that's when we came back last year and did that every weekend. from those.
And to be fair, when people come off the trail at the end of the day, they're probably less likely. They just want to get back home and have a shower or whatever, and they're less likely to want to stop and take a survey if they've been out the entire freaking day.
It was kind of condition dependent. If it was a really crummy day on the way back, people weren't very responsive. If it was a super nice day, some people were still very responsive and just very excited to talk to you, but they were almost kept it a bit shorter and a bit briefer because they were so excited to get out. So it's was kind of a trade-off there. Um, yeah.
So this doesn't speak directly to your research, but it does speak to one of the things we talked about. Larissa mentions that avalanche kits run for about $500. If you go all the way out and you get an Avi bag, that's one of those things that auto inflates to try and keep you above things and stuff. That could be another $1,500. The courses themselves are $200 to $400, and those are all per person. And at a minimum, you're going out with two people, right? Who both have the equipment. It doesn't help if one person has the equipment and they're the person buried. So Larissa says she feels like she's being held back from being able to achieve her goal of bigger hut trips and tours because she doesn't have the money, and she wants to have an Avi bag, but she feels unsafe otherwise. What are your thoughts? The only thing that pops into my mind, Sandra, is if she's taken the course, are there clubs that can help out? Are there rental services? I don't know, to be honest.
Yeah, and I've heard that that's a barrier. There's no question. I said earlier, it's accessible, it's somewhat affordable. It's still expensive. It's not as expensive as some of the other activities we talked about. So it's an investment. There's no question. And if this is where we choose to play and spend time out there and gain elevation and have some time in the backcountry in the winter, this is the cost. And this is the investment, really, the investment in our safety, the investment in our group safety and our friends' safety, and knowing that we're able to reach our destinations home safely. That's the investment in all of those steps. They're challenging. I know in some of our early days of outdoor education, people had a struggle outfitting their packs with essentials, right? And we would say, go through your family's closets and aunts and uncles and cousins and see who has gear that can help you build your essentials. We started there. Visit outdoor stores that might have sales. Visit those that have secondhand stores, thrift shopping for certain pieces of maybe layering clothing and synthetic material. There's ways to see how you can make it affordable for you, and check out the outdoor stores like Mountain Equipment Company that might rent the gear for you for the weekend, for the day, for half a day, where you have access to the gear if you already have a course under your belt, to use the gear and get out there and have some of those days. Make those practice days. Don't always make them the big, I need to get to the summit to see this view. Spend some time and stay at lower elevations and play with that gear you've rented and get comfortable with it before you head out for those bigger adventures to reach those peaks that you'd love to get to and that are awesome.
I
You've
think
got
that's
some
really
practice
important
under
when
your
you talk
belt.
about renting or borrowing stuff. Not every transceiver acts like every other transceiver. Now, every transceiver will work with every other transceiver, but your ability to understand how to flip the buttons and how to read the output of it is going to vary. Some of them will try and create a little map for you. Some of them will do a little compass thingy. Some of them will just have like little light that's going at different rates and stuff like that. It depends. So that's one of the great things about having your own gear is it works. You've practiced with it. You maybe you had an Avi bag and you actually blew it out once, and then you got it stuffed back in, and you got the additional air thing. But I caution anyone who's going to try and rent it on Friday afternoon and then go out for the weekend, because if you haven't played with that equipment, you might find yourself. And please remember that one of the key points from last webinar was that you only have 10 minutes to save that person. That's not the time to learn how the gear works.
No, and renting that and practicing is key.
Yeah.
right? And you can rent it outside of the winter season. You can rent it and practice
Sure.
it on the beach, in your yard, in the house, under the couch. You know, it doesn't have to be full on height of winter. We're in the backcountry, now I'm practicing. That's not the ideal situation. The ideal is that you've used whatever you're going to use well before that time. So make those trips to be the fun time to practice too.
Griffin, I think you know the answer to this question. Are there non-English AST courses?
I don't
I th
believe so.
no,
I could be wrong though.
there might be. You know what? Here's the really cool thing. Go on to avalanche.ca's website. I believe they list all the AST courses that you can get from all the different places. And I'm going to suggest to our anonymous attendee who asked that question, go and take a look at that and see if you can find one. And if you can't, the other thing to bear in mind is like Canada West Mountain School is one of the people who Griffin was working with. Call them up and say, hey, you know what? I've got a club out of Richmond that speaks mostly Mandarin, right? Maybe you have a club out of North Van that speaks Farsi, whatever, and see if they can hook you up because those folks actually like will try and work with you to do what they can do for the best. It's a great question. Um, and yes, so another question, and I'll ask this of Sandra. Uh, Avalanche forecast. The risk is very high, and I can also chime in here. Would search and rescue ever refuse to go to a particular location?
Would search and rescue ever refuse to go to a particular location to help somebody?
Yes, because someone is in a extremely high risk location.
Every single time before search and rescue head out to help anyone, and we'll use the specific wintertime Abbey conditions, extreme, search and rescue will assess that situation, that task, and those hazards for their safety first. They will do the assessment, collect the information, refer to the hazard ratings, refer to everything that is available as well to the public. Their safety is first. That has to be paramount before they can come and start looking for you, start searching for you, start trying to rescue you. Before they take that first step forward, they have gone through a series of steps that they have to follow. They have to follow. They're trained. They're highly unpaid professionals that are highly skilled and trained. They have to follow these guidelines before they can make that first move. So if it's not safe for them to physically go in, fly in, be long lined in, ski in, snowmobile in, they won't go unless it's safe for them first.
Yeah. Ultimately, one of the key that we always say to each other is we don't want to be the next victim. Why are we increasing the subject count, right? It doesn't make any sense. We have to make sure that we have the ability. Now, we have extra tools that can make things safer, right? But if it is inherently unsafe, we can't go. If there's no way we can make it safe enough, we can't go. The Taryn says how it whether or not you know this, Griffin, because you were talking earlier about there was an avalanche. Do you remember how accurate the avalanche forecast was and the day that Seymour person was found because just the tip of their snowshoe was popping out?
Don't
I,
remember exactly what the forecast was. I think it was considerable. It might have been high. Um, but the folks who are involved, I think weren't even aware of the danger rating.
yeah. And the
Um,
thing to remember is that low does not mean no. It doesn't.
yeah.
A low avalanche rating can still have an avalanche that is enough to bury you and cause major damage. It's just the likelihood is lower. That's what we're talking about. The likelihood of an avalanche during that time is low or considerable, or sorry, low, moderate, considerable, and high and extreme, right? The those layers are just talking about probabilities. So it's not inaccurate to say that on a day where the thing was low, there shouldn't be an avalanche. Like if an avalanche occurs, that just means that you are less likely to have one, but it could still be bad and it could still happen and you could still get trapped, right? It's just less likely.
I think that
And
considerable.
depending on where you find yourself too, sorry, I think they were actually in a small pocket of complex terrain and found themselves kind of in a little gully in a terrain trap where they otherwise thought they were kind of traveling in what looked to them like simple terrain. So
Daniel, by the way, notes that if you're talking about last year's Seymour incident, he says it was a level 4 warning throughout because he was actually on an AST field trip. So he was doing a course at that time. So there you go. But again, it can still happen at low. And considerable is, interestingly enough, and we have lots of previous webinars where we talk about this, is where most fatalities occur because people think at considerable, oh, it's not high yet. And so they aren't curtailing their activity, but it's still higher than the low, right? So there you go. Last question is whether or not there was going to be some outreach done to newcomers. Griffin, do you know whether or not, as a part of your thing, you said, did you look and see whether or not people were visitors versus mainlanders, lower mainlanders, in other words?
no, we didn't ask for where people were coming from as part of the survey. We had so many questions we wanted to ask, and just
It was a
like
long
we
survey.
said, there's kind of only a little bit amount of time you can actually get people to chat with you, so we had to chop things out, and that was one of them that didn't make the cut. Yeah, but I was gonna say, I believe there's a webinar coming up soon that might address that question specifically.
You're hired, Griffin.
Sandra?
Yeah, I can pay you in thank yous. Definitely, we do have one coming up, and it's great to bring that up. So we've got one coming up on January 29th, and it's all about newcomers visiting parks, and it's going to cover a wide range of information. But I think a lot of the participants from tonight might find that one interesting if you are part of that newcomer group. And just in general, we're going to do some promotion for that one because it covers a broad scope of users out there, which maybe you interviewed quite a few of them in your survey, Griffin. And as I mentioned, I've brought it up a few times now, we've seen that this user group change over the years. We've seen outdoor enthusiasts change. The numbers have increased, no question. And that user group, the diversity of it is vast now. It's much different than 35 years ago. So we want to try to meet the needs the best we can here at BC AdventureSmart and offer you the education that you deserve and that we can make accessible for you. So hopefully you can join us. That's January 29th. I just put the link in the chat.
Perfect. I think we're at the end of our questions.
Very good. We've wrapped it up. Griffin, you covered it all. You enlightened me. I gained a lot of information. Maybe we need to chat further and see what else I can do with the program, with that information. It's awesome that you're connected there with AvCan. I knew you were, and to see where it could go. I saw some people were joining us from all across the province, from Revelstoke to the Lower Mainland to the island, and it's great to see some of the search and rescue volunteers piping in as well. That's always comforting, and knowing that you join us. And Scott, thanks again for your expertise and your probably #1 intro. I'm going to rate that as a #1 intro. I'm going to go back and listen to it again. I might change that rating actually. The old butt's going to sign off, and we'll conclude tonight with thanking everyone for joining us. Have a great winter out there. Remember, all your preparation really does help you and your group. It also is super considerate of our 3,400 volunteers that we've got in the province here. So on behalf of all of them, thank you, and hope to see you again soon. Take care. Good night.
Good night, folks.
So, you want to be AdventureSmart?
Mm-hmm.
Good.
But what is being AdventureSmart?
Being AdventureSmart is really all about taking responsibility for your own safety and following the 3 T's.
Got it. What are the 3 T's?
What are the 3 T's? The 3 T's are the trifecta of outdoor safety. trip planning, training, and taking the essentials. The 3 T's can vary from person to person, activity to activity, and season to season. But here are some important ways to ensure you are prepared and safe on your next adventure. Trip planning. We could go on forever about this one. Trip planning is an essential step and one of the easiest ways we can stay safe on our adventures. This is something that should be done every time we head into the outdoors, whether for a few hours or multiple days. Trip planning can be broken down into 4 simple steps. Planning your travel route and navigation is about picking a trail or route based on its difficulty that's relative to your experience, ability, and the amount of time you have. Know your limits. Not all trails are created equal, so know the terrain and conditions. A 10-kilometer hike scrambling straight up a steep mountain is a lot different than a 10-kilometer stroll around a lake. Before you go anywhere, check the weather and keep checking it as things can change fast. This includes wind, precipitation, temperature, and sunset times. Finally, make sure you leave a comprehensive trip plan with a trusted contact. Keep in mind, this may not be your mom or dad or best buddy. Choose someone you can count on if you were to get into trouble. A comprehensive trip plan might be as simple as sending your trusted contact a text or email with key information about your activity, or using the AdventureSmart app, which allows you to enter a detailed trip plan. Training doesn't mean being an elite athlete or being queen of the mountain on Strava. Training is a continuous process of outdoor recreation. It's about developing the necessary skills and abilities to be safe. This might include working your way up to that big summit hike, taking a few courses to expand your wilderness and backcountry knowledge, navigation and route finding courses, or even learning more advanced skills like rescue and emergency training. You have planned and trained. Now make sure you take the essentials. Taking the essentials means packing everything you potentially need to stay warm, safe, and dry if an emergency unexpectedly arises. What if you rolled your ankle or got hurt? What if you got lost and had to spend the night outdoors? Take the time and be prepared to look after yourself. So that's it. Those are the 3 T's.
That's it.
But no matter how hard you train, how well you trip plan, and how much essential gear you bring, you may still find yourself in an emergency. And that's okay. The wilderness can be unpredictable. If you find yourself in an emergency, it's important to stop, think, observe, and plan. Use that essential gear you brought to stay warm, dry, and safe, and contact 911 on your emergency communication device. Remember, search and rescue in BC is free for everyone. Remember, safety is an outcome of good trip planning, training, and taking the essentials. It's your responsibility. So let's all do our part and be adventure smart.